the occupation was maintained. All Israel did was remove the settlers and redeploy its troops. In effect, what Israel did was it threw the keys to those who were locked up in the jail, enabled those locked up in their separate cells to free themselves from their cells. But Israel then encircled the entire jail and shut tight the gates. In January 2006, there were parliamentary elections held in Gaza, and they were, according to former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, they were free and fair elections. And unexpectedly, Hamas, the Islamic movement, it won those elections. It was actually the first time in the Arab world that through democratic elections, a government which was in office was voted out of office and a new government took power. It was a first. It was almost a second time in Iraq recently. As most of you know, they have not yet been able to actually form a new government after the government was voted out, or the status quo government was voted out. Well, after Hamas won these free and fair elections, the United States and Israel immediately imposed economic sanctions on the people of Gaza. In June 2007, the United States engaged in what's called here democracy promotion. That is to say, it tried to overthrow the Hamas government in Gaza, along with the U.S. and some Palestinian collaborators. The coup attempt proved unsuccessful. The collaborators were sent packing to the West Bank, and now Israel, along with the United States and the EU, the European Union, it tightened the blockade of Gaza, a blockade which Amnesty International called a flagrant violation of international law. It's important to bear in mind that Israel never even made the pretense that the purpose of the blockade was to prevent weapons from entering Gaza. They did not say that. There were some cases pertaining to the blockade that came before Israel's High Court. And in the course of the litigation, the state, in the cases, it did not say we are imposing a blockade because of attempted smuggling in of weapons. They said the purpose of the blockade, and now I'm quoting them, is it's a form of economic warfare against Gaza. Simply put, to punish the people enough that they will finally decide to get rid of Hamas. The former High Commissioner for Human Rights, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, a woman by the name of Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza at this point, and she said what's happening here is a civilization is being destroyed. She said, I'm not exaggerating. A civilization has been destroyed, or is being destroyed. In June 2008, there was a ceasefire negotiated by the Egyptians between Hamas and Israel. And under the terms of the ceasefire, each side had obligations. Each side had responsibilities. On the Palestinian side, basically Hamas, their obligation was they were to cease their rocket and mortar attacks on Israel. And on the Israeli side, the obligation was they were supposed to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. That siege of Gaza which was, according to Amnesty International, a flagrant violation of international law. The siege, which Mary Robinson said was destroying a civilization. Now, according to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now I'm quoting them, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. There were what Israel called rogue terrorist organizations, not Hamas, but others, which were not respecting the ceasefire, but Israel acknowledged. Hamas was attempting to stop those rogue terrorist organizations from violating the ceasefire. And in fact, by October 2008, if you look at the graphs provided by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there was all of one rocket and one mortar attack in the whole month against Israel. But on the other side, Israel refused to abide by its obligation, the obligation to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. That blockade, which is a flagrant violation of international law. By November, Israel was ready for its assault on Gaza, which it had been planning for at least a year in advance. And now all it needed was a pretext. It needed an excuse. And as Israel always does, the way it found its excuse was to kill some Palestinians in Gaza, knowing full well that it would evoke the rocket and mortar attacks again. So Israel waited until the American election day, namely November 4th, 2008, the historic election when all the attention of the media and of the American people was riveted to the result of the election. And on that day, Israeli commandos entered Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants, and knowing full well that that would trigger the Hamas rocket attacks, a resumption of those attacks, which it did. And as Amnesty International says, it was at that point that the blockade broke down. Let's just see if well, it's not so important. I can do that later if you're interested. I can cite you exactly what Amnesty wrote. In any event, even though the blockade had broken down, even though it was Israel that had caused the blockade to break down, even though Israel had not lifted the blockade of Gaza as it was obligated to do under the terms of the ceasefire or the lull that Egypt negotiated, right through the end of December 2008, Hamas kept saying, we're ready to restore the ceasefire. We're ready to restore the ceasefire. But only under the condition that Israel abide by its obligations, namely, it lift the blockade of Gaza. But Israel said no, that Hamas had to stop its rocket and mortar attacks, but it had to be an unconditional cessation of those rocket and mortar attacks. Israel would not lift the blockade of Gaza. By December 2008, as Sarah Roy, the Harvard political economist, wrote, Gaza was experiencing a complete breakdown in its society. And she said the international community was doing nothing. At this point, the leadership in Gaza, the elected government in Gaza, it really had only 2 options. And the options were to fight or to submit to their gradual